I'm Wasan Al-Khudairi. I'm the Chief Curator here at the Contemporary Art Museum, and I want to welcome you this evening. Tonight's program is generously supported by Expo Chicago and the Robert Lehman Foundation, and with special thanks to Art in America. I am thrilled tonight to introduce Paul Mpagi Sepuya, whose exhibition is currently on display here at CAM. If you haven't had a chance to see it, I encourage you to spend some time with the works. The galleries will remain open until 8 p.m. tonight, and the exhibition is up through August 18th. Paul makes photos of friends, artists, collaborators, and himself. Through his portraiture, he challenges the history of photography and deconstructs traditional portraiture by way of layering, fragmentation, mirror imagery, and the perspective of the Black queer gaze. His exhibition at CAM brings together work he's made over the last 13 years, offering audiences the opportunity to trace connections across his life and practice. A few biographical remarks about Paul before I invite him up here. Paul lives and works in Los Angeles, where he received an MFA in photography at UCLA in 2016 and a BFA from New York University's Tisch School of the Arts in 2004. Between 2005 and 2007, Paul became known for his zine series, Shoot, and his first monograph, Beloved Object, An Amorous Subject Revisited. During this time, he contributed to Butt magazine and participated in the reemergence of the queer zine culture of the 2000s. Paul went on to participate in artist residency programs at the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, the Center for Photography at Woodstock, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Fire Island Artist Residency. Paul's work is in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Guggenheim Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the International Center for Photography, and the Carnegie Museum, among others. Paul was selected for the 2019 Whitney Biennial, which is currently on display in New York. Last year, he was featured in Being New Photography 2018 at the Museum of Modern Art and Trigger, Gender as a Tool and a Weapon at the New Museum in New York City. Sepuya's exhibition here at CAM is his first museum survey featuring works from 2006 to 2018. Please join me in welcoming Paul Mpagi Sepuya.
It's really great to be back. It's like the experience of kind of seeing all of this work over, since 2005, 2006 to now is like really throws you off. It's like kind of like mind-blowing. A lot of the work, it's one of the things that's so great is like you make work over these years and you really know, you don't know where it's going to go. Like I remember when Wasan came to my studio and in LA, we were literally able to like open up boxes of work that had never been shown before. So the early works that you're seeing, you are the first audience who is seeing them outside of just me and in my studio, So to be able to make these connections over the years and really see like how images and sort of like these strategies like repeat in ways that I didn't even anticipate or know until Wasan brought them all together in this space is like a really amazing experience. So anyways, I'm gonna talk a little bit about some of my references and artists that I'm thinking about, and then sort of weave my way through past to current work. And then I hope to have enough space or time for some questions from the audience, so hopefully I'm kept on time. Okay, so I wanna lay out like a few of the things that I'm thinking about in the works. So I want to show this image, which is called A Ground, from 2016. And this is an image that is made in my studio. This was during my grad program at UCLA. And one thing that I always want to say is like none of the images that you're seeing are digital constructions. Right now I'm using digital capture, and I've moved from shooting on film to digital, but the images that you see are all made in camera. It's important for me that they exist in physical space. And so I want to show this image because what you're looking at is a mirror at a slight angle resting on a bench in my studio so that you actually can't see the camera that is photographing the scene, but you kind of catch a glimpse of the tripod that's holding it up, which is there on sort of the left. One of the things that's hard to see in the the projection on the screen is the smudges. So on that, this image I'm really interested in both like the presence and the absence. So in the center of the image, we're left with sort of the residue of a body that is no longer there, which was my friend Evan, who was sitting for a portrait. But yet we have sort of like a fragment of another image, which is a sliver of, that you can kind of see clipped to another mirror back there, that is made in another friend's studio. So I'm really interested in the way, in these actual physical constructions, using the mirror, using space to kind of collapse an image together, that the studio, that the process of photography, everything kind of like holds all this material across different sort of like locations, across different times. I'm interested in what I sort of call like a collage of compressed tenses, which comes from Brian O'Doherty's essay Studio and Cube. And then the portrait. So this is a recent portrait of my friend Anthony, who lives in New York, who was visiting Los Angeles. And it's often said that in a lot of the works that there's this, play of like revealing, or like concealing, and like sort of like concealing and disclosure or whatever. But all of the work starts with portraits and very much the presence of myself and these friends. Anthony's also a photographer, and our friendship began through these conversations around photography. And so it's important to know that across the practice, whenever you see a fragment of a body, that body is represented somewhere else fully. And often I am a subject of these other photographers' work. And then there's images like this studio wall, which kind of gets into this conversation around collage. These images, what you see when you're looking at something like studio wall or some of these other that are in the show back there, is the ways in which my own images references sometimes kind of like the reopening of my own archive of material, which in this case is test strips of archival pigment prints, as well as laser prints. They're just sort of like pinned up noteboards in my studio. So in this, you can sort of see that like I'm thinking about everything from Fassbender's The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant, which, is there? No, we don't have a pointer on here. In there too, like Bouguereau's paintings of water girls, to Manet's studio. I think this is like the Pink studio in here. There's a sliver of a portrait of where the figure of Nina Simone is not present, but we can sort of see this fabric that's behind here, as well as my own snapshots. So in this way, these collages are about sort of like bringing together all of this material in the photograph, rather than making, these are not sort of like collages that are glued and pasted down. They exist, they come together in an image, and then they disperse. And then the mirror studies, which kind of holds all of these things. So again, these are physical constructions in the studio. What you're looking at here is a figure that's cut a fragment of a portrait that was made in a separate studio that belonged to a friend, which is taped to the surface of the mirror, which obstructs the camera and tripod apparatus. And this sort of obstruction came as a way for me to sort of, I'd been making these images where this apparatus was repeating at its center over and over, and I was sort of cutting freehand these shapes to obscure it and to sort of play around with that. And so you see my hand in physical space holding this image, this up to the mirror's surface. The other hand that you see there is actually just a sort of a cut out fragment of another image, sort of creating the illusion of the second hand there. So that is a flat image. And then you can sort of see the little bit of that black up top, which is the edge of the lens of the camera that's taking the picture. So whenever you see a tripod reflected in space, you're looking at the tripod that's holding up the camera that's making the picture. Okay, so, and then I want to show a few installation views just so you can get a sense. But actually that's not, I usually throw these in there actually because we're not in the presence of an exhibition where you can actually sort of stand in front of it, because scale is very important to the work. And so there's generally two things that are happening with the works that are 57 or 51 by 34, or roughly 60 by 80, the very large work there and sort of the medium-sized ones. The very large ones present the camera tripod apparatus at a one-to-one scale, almost a sculptural relationship to standing in front of this device that is pointed at you. And then the works like that you see on the right hand of this image, right side of this image, and behind you there, reproduce roughly what's reflected in the surface of the mirror as a one-to-one scale. In this case, that's my body. And so I'll just sort of cycle through these really quickly. So this is from a show in Chicago 2 years ago now. Wow, time goes by. Okay, and so with this is an installation view of a series of works called Exposures. And what you're looking at here at first seems like sort of like these red kind of like abstractions, and you have these slivers, and if you spent time and look at those in that back room, you start to notice that you see kind of slivers of my own body reflected in those cuts. And what's happening here is I've printed this material out. And for me, it's actually important to say that like whenever you see image fragmentation that sort of looks abstract, it's not abstract. It actually comes from like out there in the world. And this will lead to some of these references that I'm talking about, but what you're actually looking at is images taken at a bar in Los Angeles at night, and it's fragments of several friends' bodies sort of like cast under this light. And so I'm sort of moving through the cuts in these and photographing myself. And I'm really interested in the idea of sort of sequence within these. But what I'm thinking about with this, and this kind of has a lot to do with this work from about 2016 to now, is generally falls under the project titled Darkroom. And I'm thinking about like my own initial experiences learning black and white photography as a teenager, and sort of this, which is also a moment that one sort of connects their own sort of like personal desires, drives, emerging sort of like ideas of agency and sexuality with this primary viewing and touching experience within the darkroom, which what I'm talking about there is like that this attunement to viewing, how do I say it? Who here is like, has been in the black and white darkroom and knows how to make photographs, right? It's like oh yes, okay. Sometimes it's like you're not in a room of photographers, right? So I'm interested in connecting this experience to a social experience. So with the darkroom, it's like you have to know how to see something before you bring it out into the light, right? You have to be attuned to how this image develops, but the final viewer does not have that primary viewing experience, right? But I'm also thinking about the history of darkrooms socially in terms of like queer and black and brown socializing, where often we had to go into the space behind what was permitted in public, right? And I'm thinking about those primary social experiences, those primary sets of touch and of recognition, and how you navigate that in the rest of the world out there. So I like to put together these images of the dark room and then the dark room, and this is at Brighton Sauna in England. I just found this one on the internet. I've actually never been to the UK. But you know, there's this like nice repetition here between these things, but also, and I can talk more about that also, but you know, I'm also going back to thinking about, when it comes to these influences, for me, Fire, which was published in 1926, I hope I got this right, maybe it's 27. I'm thinking about the graphic design of this here. So Fire includes the first publicly acknowledged writing by a queer black American author, Richard Bruce Nugent, in a story called Smoke, Lilies, and Jade, which is set, it's a, how to summarize it, it's a first person stream of conscious short story where he's wandering through the alleyways, following footsteps, moving into and out of jazz clubs and parties. His own subjectivity is more formed by the recognition of those people he sees and the naming of names and negotiating the sort of like desire between a male subject named Beauty and a friend who's whom he loves named Melva. And you know, for me, there was a long time when I was making portraiture where I had to really acknowledge that my picking up the camera and aiming it at these people around me was very similar to the way that the text works in Bruce Nugent's Smoke, Lilies, and Jade, because in order to sort of like, his character isn't really fleshed out in there. You're really only left to like, what is his position within this? And for me, making portraiture was about trying to find out where and who I was through looking at the people around me. This is a portrait of Bruce Nugent by Carl van Vechten, who we could have a whole like symposium on him. If you don't know him, look him up. But anyways, I'm interested in like the confluence of things that come together to make this portrait, because Van Vechten being both like a patron, but also kind of like a creepy, like trolling of, and using his position and also using the space that the photographer's studio allows in bringing people in, breaking down sort of boundaries, but the portraits, according to gossip, that Van Vechten was making was sort of this, in an attempt to sort of seduce Bruce Nugent, who really wouldn't have any of it. But one of the things that's interesting is like, for all the problems of Van Vechten, we're left behind with this beautiful archive of a world, but we are left with all of its complications as well. And I'm really interested in the complications also that arise from the making of portraiture, making of photography. This is another Van Vechten image. And with this, I'm really interested in like the staging. You see drapery and you see fabric and things in a lot of my work, and there's less of the ones that play off of this image in this exhibition, but there was a time where I was using a lot of these gold and silver fabrics and thinking about this mid-20th century sort of staging. Like fabric is the cheapest thing to kind of like bring into a photograph to make it look like art, right? So like if you think about like George Platt lines, and this one doesn't include his work with like fabric and drapery, like the easiest way to make like a sexy picture of like a man or a woman that you want to take just because you want a sexy picture is to like put drapery in it, right? It's like they knew how to use like the tropes of surrealism in the 30s and 40s to like elevate it, right? Elevate, yeah, we like that word now. So I'm really interested in those things that are brought into like, kind of like photography existing on this like weird, anxious edge. But yeah, this George Platt lines image uses, this sort of, like the surrealist kind of like lighting and shadow, right? But also, I'm thinking a lot about literature as well that's kind of like taking place at this time. To talk really briefly about this, has anyone read Orlando? And there's also like an exhibition, interesting timing, that's up in New York at Aperture Foundation, around this text, but it's one of the best texts for that I can think of in positioning the making of portraiture in all of the mess it kind of like brings together in the creating of an image. So the text is working with ideas of genre and working with ideas of sort of like history and personal narrative. Virginia Woolf sort of writes her former lover and close friend Vida into this character of Orlando, which is about not only the entire history, 500 history of Vida's life translated into Orlando, but also a way of sort of wrapping her up, bringing her together, a person that she couldn't be I guess what's the way to say it? Sometimes we make art out of a person because we need to be able to sort of like contain them in a way that the relationship could not, and so this character does that. But then there's this really lovely photo collaboration that Virginia and her sister Vanessa do with Vida, using Vida to then stage the portraits of this character Orlando. And so the thing around this, and along with Van Vechten, like all of the texts that surround this, we could have like days of conversation on, is that like these moments in art making that cross the boundaries of genre and of disciplines, in the way in which like one can only understand the photograph through leaving photography behind and having to go into the realms of literature, in the ways in which literature kind of has to be left behind for biography. Like this is one of the things that I'm really interested in, which leads into this next image. Gosh, I have a lot of references. I swear I'll get to my own stuff soon. But this portrait of Alice Walker by Jean Weisinger, which does a similar thing, and I think it's in her diaries or an essay I read, Jean described, this project she was doing in the 70s of wanting to make portraits of gay and lesbian, bi, queer women, because there wasn't a body of work for her to look at her community at that time. So she had to go out and do it. She reached out to Alice Walker as one of the subjects, and she describes how, she's like super nervous to approach this, but like Alice is like, well, if you take my picture, you have to sit for a picture that I'm gonna take. And so this image, seeing myself through Alice Walker's eyes, she describes as like this kind of flipping of the script as kind of allowing to push her forward into her own practice. And again, it's like we don't think of Alice Walker as a photographer, but here her role as a photographer was very formative for another photographer's work. And if anyone has not read The Same River Twice by Alice Walker, it's one of the best writings on the process of art making and putting work out into the world and the ways in which it comes back to you and having to sort of like deal and respond to it. It's about beloved and everything around that. No, I made a mistake there. Anyways, Mapplethorpe. I don't know what to say about Mapplethorpe other than the fact that the thing I'm interested in Mapplethorpe is the incredibly uncomfortable position that a black viewer or a viewer of color has in primarily white spaces. The fact that this control that Mapplethorpe has in his work almost extends out of the pictures. And in a sense, like, I'm really interested in these ideas of control and of camera position and subject position, but there's a way in which I can never be fully like an autonomous viewer in these sort of primarily white spaces navigating through this space. I almost always feel kind of like thrown into the image and the presence in mixed companies, so to speak, And I'm really interested in sort of like finding a way around those complications. Artists like Rotimi Fani-Kayode is interesting with that as well, because the fact that his work is coming to greater public recognition right now, I think is really important to recognize these contemporaries. The fact that of the stealing of these artists by figures like Mapplethorpe, but also I love this image because it is literally situating, I can't separate this from my own work, in literally situating the camera directly back at you, but I can't help but think that he is pointing it back out to someone like Mapplethorpe. And then an artist like Larry Rivers, I'm really interested in the capacity for photography or for art making to disclose types of information, types of unsanctioned knowledge, like the sorts of gossip that doesn't neatly fall into categories of art history, the ways in which Larry Rivers' work gossips. And so this one is made during the moment of his affair with Frank O'Hara. And this is the full painting, The Studio from '56. But the ways in which there's these sort of like dual roles kind of like being negotiated in there. And then Lyle Ashton Harris is an artist who I'm thinking about a lot when it comes to the idea of layering and collage, because in this way in which works, do I have a detail here? Where he not only incorporates the ongoing kind of like collection and accumulation of material in his studio, in his world, but he's able to bring back bodies of work and images and objects that have already had lives in institutions. But he is an artist, when all of us who are artists, we can always bring the work back and we can modify it, we can change it, we can recombine it and find new meaning. And it's incredibly inspiring to me, and he's one of the people who really helped me think about a lot of the images that I was making that I didn't really think of as artwork, which is where the collage really begins for me. But okay, now we're gonna get to my work. This is a self-portrait, which is originally published in Butt magazine in 2008. The portrait is from 2005. When I was talking about this kind of at a certain point when I started making portraits of having to acknowledge why I was making portraits of these people who were close to me, I also realized that I had to also be a subject of that work. It could not be sort of a one-way vector. But the other thing that happened is this work was going out in between about 2005 and 2008, when like originally just like Friendster, then becomes like MySpace, becomes Facebook, at the same time that this whole sort of like queer zines explosion is happening. And like in ways in which I did not or could not have anticipated, the images started to circulate faster than we knew what to do with them. The ways in which certain images, certain people become notorious through the public, the reproduction and distribution and circulation of these images. And so quickly, the focus of the portraits shifted from, I had this like very, photography has that like, gives us this illusion of like certainty, right? The technology of photography produces an incredibly sharp, if you want it to be sharp, you can blur it if you want to, but it provides the illusion of a certain type of sharpness, of fixity, that like the world is unstable, right? But photography is a technology that makes these images I'm talking about like my own personal shit, right? But like we can talk about all the social and political and like global ways in which the problem that photography, that we aimed our cameras at people, at places, at things, and we thought that we knew it, and then we could define it and move forward. Like that's, whatever. That's like the root of why that technology developed, right? But when it comes to personal relationships, that becomes incredibly complicated and became incredibly complicated very fast for me in making portraits. And so the work around it became about everything that was accumulated and sort of like happened after the making of the portraits. So zine making became the thing of like really like playing into this way of putting the work out into the world, and sort of seeing what came back to me. These are some images from these early zines. Go through real quick. Oh, and this one's in this show here. And this image here was probably around the time when I was having to let go of, or actually having to like acknowledge and work with the actual split between photography's ability to solve something. Like this image was made over the course of a conversation with my friend Josh, who we had briefly dated, and then we're left with this very complicated friendship for a year. And I kept trying to make portraits of him to sort of kind of like solve it. I'm like, now we're gonna know, like we got it, right? And then I was like, oh wait, no. How can I make a work that's about the sort of like that difference between the thing that you're aiming for and how your aiming has actually kind of changed it. And this is, around 2007, 2008 is where that shift started to begin. This is another work that's made around that time, also that were made over these conversations. This is called Michael Dialogue. And here's a frame. So these were all just made in either my kitchen or my bedroom in Brooklyn. I lived in this little row house with some friends, and I was just making photographs with my Mamiya RZ over the years, going to the darkroom, printing them, working a day job. I was shooting with like a monohead strobe, like because most of these were all done at night because we were all working day jobs, and we're just kind of like, when I could fit things in. So this was part of this thinking of time in a different way was also because it was incredibly hard to find the time to make the work, or sometimes I would shoot the work and it would sit for like weeks or months before I could access the printing of it or to be able to get to a darkroom. So also a gap opened up between the moment when I was making the photographs and thinking this is what I want to aim for, and the moment when I would finally return to the images and I would find something completely different. And then I want to sort of do this jump which kind of really leads into this here. So the work moved from my home and the homes of friends to the studio. And this is an image that was made at my residency at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And so my friend Darren here this is probably the second series of portraits of him, that the the work has changed, but a lot of the people in the work have continued across projects. And so this also, entering the studio introduced another element of time. So at that point, the studio became a space where everything that was brought into it could be simultaneously present, whether it was from something that was currently like just made and in process or had brought back again. This is again where like Lyle's influence became really important for me. So I'll kind of flip through these. The Studio Museum, you can sort of start to see a kind of a spatial collage happening. And also ideas of mirroring, because another thing is like I started bringing physical mirrors into my space in 2014, but a type of mirroring had happened for the fact of oftentimes people responding to existing images out there. And in this one, this portrait of Daniel is as much a portrait of him as a response to his relationship to to the other man who's in the corner. This little kind of like Ryan is sort of like slumped in that print there. So this is all from that Studio Museum residency. Kind of go through, and then another jump here. Yeah, I forgot I put this one in. I love this one. So again, the work has in a certain way also become like an I didn't intend to set out to do like a documentary of these friendships and of these people, but it's interesting, like, this is now like 19 years into our friendship, and probably maybe 8 or 9 portraits over the years it's really interesting to look back and see how we've all grown together. And then I want to jump to this idea, again, of reflection, which part of the thing about reflection was about acknowledging my own, because one can sort of like aim the camera, but I was really interested in, before I was working with the physical mirrors, of actually implicating myself in these sites of making of portraiture or of photography around these sort of friendships. So this is in my friend TM's studio. While I was interested in making images of other artists making portraits, and this was sort of a first attempt at that, like throwing myself back in the image. This is another from that set. This, I guess I'll go quickly past studio work because this is one iteration of it, but you can see another one in there. But what studio work is all of the material that was accumulated of sort of like my test prints and research while I was at that residency. And so it exists as sort of like not a fixed archive, but a resource from which I continue to pull imagery and relationships. And so every time it's presented, the work is organized based on what is happening contemporaneously with those relationships and other images. But then what happens, kind of like leading through to these original mirror collages, the ones with the more sort of like gridded fragmentation, is these come from a time when for about 3 years when I didn't have a studio. And after the Studio Museum, my studio became my coffee table, the kitchen in Brooklyn, or the tote bag that I carried around with me, or biked around with a backpack. And so I didn't have access to darkrooms anymore. I kind of got priced out, and the last ones were sort of closing. So I got a laser printer from Staples, and I put it under my desk in my bedroom, and I just started printing out everything. My phone snapshots, any scans I had, references, and bundling these into sort of, with binder clips became the bounds of my studio. And there's an image back there you'll see, it's kind of like, it's from my kitchen in Brooklyn. There's a coffee cup, there's like a stack of papers with clips, and then several other things in there. That was the bounds of my studio. But what started to happen was, so this was made in my friend Brendan Fernandez's studio when he was away on a residency, and I would have these moments where I could sort of unfurl things, and I would photograph them, and I could sort of start to arrange them, and then they would come back together. And so when you see these images, again, on the wall, there's some that were made during a residency in Chicago. There's sort of these timestamps of relations between images. But this is where the work on the mirror surfaces come together. So if I jump ahead, This is one of the very first ones. So you see that really large one in there. It's very formal and it looks resolved and everything. But they really started off as my return to the studio in 2014 and having all of this unresolved material. And I began collecting these mirrors from Home Depot or wherever, putting them in my studio and using their surfaces as a way to hold this, like literally all of this stuff, and then photographing myself through them. And an interesting thing about these is that in their making, I'm always a part of the composition. I'm always reflected in its surface, but in its making, I can either stay in it or I can put the camera on a tripod, set it on a timer and walk away. But I'm interested in this fact that like I'm always sort of like within, like kind of like, I kind of called it like enclosed within the images. So this is what leads to this later work that you're seeing. Because it was very important for me that like I'm physically present, both behind the camera, in its reflection, but also this interesting thing that happens where when you're standing in front of these, you might think that, for example, you might not catch at first that this camera that I'm holding piercing through this cloth is the camera that's making the image. Maybe someone else took this picture of me, but as it's revealed that it's a mirror surface, what happens, suddenly it's revealed that it's already a closed loop, that you should be included formally in its image because that's what a mirror does. But in this way that you're like both implicated by it aimed at you, but realize that there's an impossibility of you being within this space. I'm sort of like very much interested in that, as well as this idea of like, again, if I bring it back to the beginning as I wind down, this idea of the darkroom comes in here as well, because in the creation of these spaces to be seen, there's always the implication of a space that is not meant to be seen. And what happened there is also made for the possibility of this reversal that I've been playing with, which within the darkroom is that there is all of this. If we go to that first image that I showed with the latent sort of like smudges on the mirror surface that you can't really see, but I know they're there because it's reflecting the white studio walls. We love white, bright studio spaces, right? But there's a certain type of information that can only be seen when we go back into darkness, or we prioritize darkness, blackness as the grounds upon which this can be seen. I hope I made that sentence make sense. Basically, all of the traces on the mirror's surface are rendered invisible when we prioritize the bright white spaces, and I realized that only against the reflection of my body or by going behind the backdrop when I set up images like this and this could that be revealed. So in these spaces is where I'm really like interested in this. So when you look at those images on that first wall back there, people were thinking it's smoke, but no, it's not smoke. It's the traces of my own hand when I'm making those left behind from making when the mirror studies, or they're from the bodies of friends who are leaning against those surfaces and leaving their own traces behind. So this is some recent work I think I'll kind of end with. This is one of the earlier mirror studies, this attempt at photographing its surface. I was actually constructing like a dark room, dark cloth around the mirror and moving my camera inside and pulling it back enough to let a little bit of light through for you to kind of catch its surface. I can go past these because you can see them in the space. Yeah. So I think I'll just maybe open it up to questions if there's time. But yeah, this is kind of where I'm at now. It's always funny when you get to the end of an artist talk, it's like the work is so recent you kind of haven't really resolved it all yet. I'm still like figuring it out. So yeah, I'll just let a few flip through as we move on. Okay. How did I do on time? Did I go over? Oh, great. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
What is the significance of the collaboration with your subjects?
Oh, yes, I didn't get to that. I mean, it's like so entangled in a beautiful way. It's like it's inseparable, you know. So the allowing myself to be a subject of my friend's work became an important part of me being able to make the work sort of from the very beginning. But more recently, I've been interested in collaboration when it comes to images like this and like this. So, you know, for example, like James and Dicko are friends who are also photographers. And when I became interested in making images with, let's say, 2-point perspectives, or 1-point perspective and the indication of another that could not be seen, it was important that none of the subjects depicted are staging the making of a photograph, right? So if you see my camera, you know I'm making it. If you see Dicko's camera, you know he's making it, right? So these works, trying to figure out the language around what these works are has been really tricky, and that's what the Whitney Biennial project has sort of like allowed us to start working through. So in a certain sense, there's an acknowledgement that this is my image, and I wish I had brought images that are from the Whitney show, because at the Whitney, you don't see my image, any of my images from, let's say, this session that we shot together. You only see Dicko Chan's work, and it is credited to him as the photographer. It's in my space, so it's in an environment that I've created, but his work looks very different from mine. He's shooting on 35 millimeter, and he has like a really sort of like, it has a very different feel where we sort of both become the subject of a work in a different way. With James's work, he's shooting on a Rolleiflex black and white 120 film, so his work also looks very different, and again, we don't see in the Whitney my images from this shoot. We see his work where he has posed me as a subject that fits in about. I'm also really interested in those questions of like, when I talked about having to leave certain genres or certain disciplines to like ask questions about in another realm, all of these elements, even when I was going into the other artist studios, I was interested in asking people to like leave this thing behind that I'm working with and like start to ask questions about these other artists' work. So what we're looking at here is my images. I've co-organized the presentation of their images at something like the Biennial, but then, you know, this is an image that Steiner and I have credited as my image, but the image that we've shown at the Biennial is one that she directed, that she wanted for herself, made in my studio. So in that, we've co-authored it. There are also images that were made under the guise of camera lessons with two friends who are not photographers. So those are collaborations in a sense that I'm showing them how to use the apparatus. They're making the exposures, but they are then making the decisions on which images to be shown, how they're shown, you know. So there's kind of like a gradient within these, and then there are collaborations like you can see in the exhibition there, like with the British designer Grace Wales Bonner, where she sends me material and we email and text back and forth, and then I print out this material and I arrange it on the mirror surface and I make images and send them back to her. And so the material you see depicted is hers. They're made in collaboration. The final images are mine, and then she uses some element of my work for her own things. So it's interesting. The last thing to say about it though is someone once asked about like the power dynamics within it and how that's changed, because it's very different from the earlier work where we were all like quite young and maybe all had done like 1 or 2 group shows in Bushwick, right? And now as we have different levels of access, it's raised other challenging questions about the nature of collaboration. But I'm really interested in the idea of like making space where possible, rather than really sort of like hammering down like singular authorship. Anyways, yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you for your talk. It was a really beautiful set of work and a great description. I find the use of the word staging much more present in your work than collage. Mm-hmm. Do you see your photography as more adjacent to directing in the sense of theater or film, or to the original home of collage, painting? So basically, why collage and not staging as your privileged word?
Oh, okay. So I forgot, I have a couple more images. This one is titled Drop Scene. There's a series of work that I'm working on over the past little bit and still figuring out. The title is now Drop Scene. I'm really interested in this idea of like, kind of like really playing up and acknowledging the the fact that at a certain point, let's see, when I first started making work, there was no audience besides me and a few other friends who might be interested, right? The work starts to go out there and it kind of creates this space ahead of it. And so at a certain point, we could no longer make work without acknowledging that there was a pre-existing series of viewers or a whole chain of of people to receive the work and then having to respond to it. So at that point, it becomes performative. It becomes like improv. I don't know. Like you have to like play with your audience, right? And so then also the photographer's studio. One of these things that I'm interested in the entire lineage of that, even going back to the painter's studio. Like I'm really interested in these photographs from the 19th century of Rodin's studio, where there's like a lot of sculptures of naked women and then like naked women hanging around, but like none of them have cameras to like point and show you what their experience is. Anyways, there's a performativity in all of that, and the photographer's studio. There's a desire for people to enter into that space and participate. And so I'm really interested in this idea of using the curtain not as sort of like the backdrop as before, but as the idea that it might be parting and something might be the setup for a series of things to happen. So I'm trying to figure that out. And yeah, I like that suggestion of yours because the collages only exist at a certain moment in time, and for all of the works, because they're really acknowledging that point perspective of the camera and that moment that they're being made, is if you were to walk into my studio with all this stuff pinned up on the mirror surface, you wouldn't see that picture, that final image, anywhere in my studio. You only see it if you bend down and look through the viewfinder of the camera. But the moment you move around, that dynamic surface is changing. The collage, if I had made a physical collage, you would move around its perspective, but it would be a fixed object, you know? So in a certain sense, there's performativity, yeah, in that.